"I'm sorry, ma'am, I really am," he said, in the slow, flattened voice people use when they have decided someone cannot understand them. "But I'm going to need you to speak English, real English, not whatever that is." He smiled at his partner when he said it, a quick sideways smile, the kind that assumes it won't be seen. The woman sitting across from him at the precinct table did not react immediately. She was 73 years old, and she was wearing a church dress, deep green, pressed, with small pearl buttons at the collar, and she held a black handbag in her lap with the specific posture of a person who was raised to sit straight, in rooms that didn't deserve it. She looked at the officer for a moment with the calm, level attention of a professor who has heard a student say something incorrect and is deciding how much rope to extend before the correction. Then she set her handbag on the table. She folded her hands, and in a voice that was clear and unhurried and absolutely precise, she said, "Si per Anglicum linguam intelligis, per Latinum quoque intelligere potes, difficilior test." Officer Dennis Prater stared at her. The room was very quiet. His partner, a younger officer named Castillo, was looking at the tabletop. Her name was Dr. Vivienne Eugenia Boudreau Holloway. She had 3 earned degrees. She had spent 41 years in a university classroom. And what she had just said to the officer, in a language he had not heard since, at best, a single semester of high school, was, "If you can understand English, you can understand Latin. It is only more difficult." In the hallway outside the interview room, behind a window of reinforced glass, a woman had been watching this exchange for approximately 4 minutes. She was not a police officer. She was not a lawyer. She was the reason this situation was about to change completely, and she had just picked up her phone. What happened next? What was going to happen in the next 12 minutes in this building was going to be documented, reviewed, and discussed for a very long time. But before we get there, have you ever been made to feel small in a language? Have you ever had the way you speak used against you, like the sound of your words was evidence of something? Let me take you back. 50 years. The fall that Vivienne Boudreau arrived at Howard University as a freshman. She was 18 years old, from New Orleans, and she had read more books than most of her professors would ever assign in a single course. This was not arrogance. This was inventory. She had cataloged it herself, carefully, in the summer before she left home, sitting in the back bedroom of the house on Touro Street where she had grown up, going through every book she had read since the age of 7, writing the title and author in a spiral notebook in her precise, forward-leaning cursive. There were 219 of them. Her mother, a woman named Celestine, who taught piano to neighborhood children and believed that discipline and beauty were the same thing, approached from different angles, had watched her daughter do this and said nothing. She had recognized the gesture for what it was, a girl preparing herself by taking account of what she already had, before walking into the world that was going to try to tell her it was not enough. The house on Touro Street was not large, but it was precise. Every surface was considered. Every object had been chosen. In the front parlor there was an upright piano, a braided rug in dark red and gold, and on the wall beside the window, a framed print of a painting, a woman in a blue dress reading, her back to the viewer, the light falling across the open page in her hands. Vivienne had grown up looking at that painting. She had thought about it most of her life. What the woman was reading, whether she finished it, whether anyone had ever told her to put it down. There was also, on the small side table beside the piano, a green leather dictionary. Not English, but Latin. A 1947 edition of Lewis and Short, thick as a small Bible, its cover worn to a softer shade of green at the corners from decades of handling. It had belonged to Vivienne's grandfather, a man named Eustace Boudreau, who had been a classics teacher in New Orleans at a time when a black man teaching Latin was a statement of such deliberate, elegant defiance that his students had not fully understood what he was doing for them until they were grown. Eustace had died before Vivienne was born. She had inherited the dictionary and the story of him and the understanding that language was never simply communication. Language was territory. The decision to master a language, any language, especially the ones the powerful claimed as their exclusive inheritance, was the decision to stand on ground that someone had spent a long time trying to convince you was not yours. She had begun studying Latin at 14 with the Lewis and Short Dictionary, and a used grammar her mother found at a church sale. She had continued at Howard, where she took every classics course offered and wrote an honors thesis on Cicero's use of rhetorical amplification in the Philippics. She had continued at Yale, where she completed a doctorate in classical languages and comparative rhetoric. She had returned to Howard as a faculty member at the age of 28 and had not left for 41 years, becoming, in that time, a full professor, a department chair, a recipient of the American Philological Association's Award for Distinguished Scholarship, and one of the most widely cited scholars of African-descended engagement with classical antiquity in the English-speaking world. She had published 11 books. She had supervised 62 doctoral students. She had delivered the commencement address at Howard 3 times. The last time she gave it in Latin for the first half, a deliberate choice, an homage to Eustace, a gesture toward the idea that the languages of scholarship belonged to everyone who was willing to learn them. And then, in English, said, "That was Latin. If you did not understand it, that is entirely fine. It took me years. What matters is that no one can tell you it is beyond you. Nothing is beyond you. That is not inspiration. That is a fact." She had retired the previous spring, at 72, reluctantly, and only because her daughter, a woman named Paulette, who was an attorney in Atlanta and had the precise, relentless quality of a person trained to win arguments, had been making the case for 3 years that it was time. She had moved to Atlanta to be near Paulette and her grandchildren. She had brought the Lewis and Short Dictionary. She had brought the framed print. She had brought the green velvet box that held the American Philological Association medal, not to display it, but because it was earned, and earned things were treated with care. She had been in Atlanta for 7 months when the incident happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October. She had been driving home from the Botanical Garden, where she volunteered on Tuesday mornings helping catalog the Latin nomenclature on plant signage, a project proposed by the garden's director after learning who Vivienne was and which Vivienne had accepted because it was useful and precise, and because she liked the garden's quality of attention to living things. She had been pulled over 3 blocks from her daughter's house. A broken taillight, she was told. She had not known about the taillight. She had been entirely cooperative. She had provided her license and registration without hesitation. The officer, Dennis Prater, 11 years on the force, a man whose record included 2 prior complaints of discourteous conduct, both filed by women, both resolved without formal action, had looked at her license, and looked at her, and looked at her license again. "You've got an address in Washington, D.C. here," he said. "I moved recently," she said. "I haven't yet had the license updated. I'm happy to provide my current address." "Can you speak up, ma'am? I'm having a hard time understanding you," she repeated herself clearly. She had a slight New Orleans accent, deep and warm, the kind that has been shaped by French and Creole and Baptist Sunday mornings and 40 years of classroom projection, and it was a beautiful accent, an unmistakable one, and it was in no way difficult to understand. "Is English your first language?" Prater asked. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "because I'm having some difficulty with the accent," she said, again with patience she had not yet decided he deserved. "I was born in New Orleans. I have lived in the United States my entire life. English is my first language. I also speak French, Latin, some Greek, and conversational Italian." Prater looked at his partner. The partner, Castillo, 26 years old, 14 months on the job, who had been raised by a grandmother who would have recognized Vivienne Boudreaux Holloway on sight, looked away. "I'm going to need you to come in," Prater said. "The address discrepancy, and I need to make sure I can understand what you're telling me." She was brought to the precinct. She was placed in an interview room. She was not handcuffed. She was not charged with anything. But she was in a room, and the door was closed, and Dennis Prater sat across from her with 11 years of a particular kind of confidence, and he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I really am, but I'm going to need you to speak English, real English, not whatever that is." And she looked at him, and she set her handbag on the table, and she folded her hands, and she responded in Latin. Now, the woman in the hallway, her name was Captain Renata Osi Mensa. She was 44 years old, and had been on the force for 19 years, and she was the watch commander on duty that Tuesday afternoon, and she had been called to the observation window by a desk sergeant named Hollins who had watched the intake process and had a feeling, the kind that develops in people who have been paying attention long enough to recognize when something is about to become a problem that could have been avoided. Osi Mensah had watched through the glass for 4 minutes. She had watched Prater perform his routine. She had watched the woman, in the green dress, receive it with the patience of a person who was storing everything, cataloging it, deciding what to do with it later. She had watched the Latin. She had not understood the Latin, but she had understood everything else. She picked up her phone. Not to Internal Affairs, not yet. First, to Paulette. Paulette Holloway was in a deposition when her phone buzzed. She looked at the number, recognized the precinct's exchange, and said, "I need 5 minutes," stood up, and walked into the hallway. Osi Mensah told her what had happened. She kept it brief. She said, "Your mother is fine. She is in an interview room. She has not been charged with anything, and she apparently just responded to Officer Prater in Latin, which I can't verify, but the desk sergeant is reporting it." "I want you here," Paulette said. "I'm 12 minutes away." A pause. "Did she correct his pronunciation?" Osi Mensah said, "I'm sorry." Paulette said, when she answered in Latin, "Did she correct his pronunciation?" "Because she will." A brief silence. Osi Mensah said, "I'll see you in 12 minutes." In the interview room, Dennis Prater was still staring at the woman across from him. He had the look of a man who had reached for a familiar tool and found it missing. The slow speech, the exaggerated enunciation, the performance of patient condescension. It required a particular response from the other side to function, and the woman across from him had declined to provide it. He said, "What did you just say?" Vivienne said in English graciously, "I said that if you can understand English, you can understand Latin. Latin is simply more demanding. It requires closer attention to endings." She paused. "I can repeat it more slowly if that would help." Prater's jaw was doing things jaws do when the architecture of a situation has. Collapsed. Castillo, beside him, had developed a sudden and intense interest in his own notepad. Vivienne reached into her handbag. She produced, from an interior pocket, a business card. She slid it across the table. Prater picked it up. It read, "Dr. Vivienne E. Boudreau Holloway, Professor Emerita, Department of Classical Studies, Howard University, Specializations, Latin, Rhetoric, Comparative Philology, African Engagement with Classical Antiquity." Beneath that, a line of text in small italics, "Recipient, American Philological Association Award for Distinguished Scholarship, 2019. Prater looked at the card. He looked at the woman. He looked at the card again. Vivienne said pleasantly, "I also have identification. I mentioned the address discrepancy. I have documentation of my current Atlanta residence in my bag if you'd like it." She produced a utility bill, a lease agreement, and a bank letter, all with her Atlanta address, all paper clipped together with the tidiness of a person who had known, at some level, that she might one day need them. She had always been prepared. 50 years of classrooms had not been the only thing shaping her. The door opened. Captain Osi Mensah stepped in, and behind her, heels first, came Paulette Holloway in her deposition suit, and she looked at her mother. And her mother looked at her, and some things passed between them that had been passing between Vivienne and Paulette their entire lives and required no language at all, Latin or otherwise. Paulette said, "Mama, are you all right?" Vivienne said, "Perfectly. I've been having an interesting conversation." Paulette looked at Prater. He was still holding the business card. She said, "Captain Osi Mensah, I'd like a full accounting of the basis for detaining my mother, the officer's conduct during this interview, and any recordings from the intake and interview process. I'd also like to know whether there's a copy of the intake officer's prior complaint, history available for review." She paused. "That's a separate request." Prater set the business card on the table. Osi Mensah said to Vivienne, "Dr. Boudreau Holloway, you're free to go. I apologize for the circumstances that brought you here." Vivienne stood. She smoothed her dress. She picked up her handbag. She looked at Dennis Prater for a long moment, not with contempt, but with the specific gaze of a woman who has spent 41 years identifying the students who believe they have nothing left to learn. she said. "Officer, the word for the thing you demonstrated today is condescensio. It is a Latin word. You're welcome." Then she walked out. Castillo stared at the wall. What unfolded over the following weeks was neither quick nor small. Paulette filed a formal complaint with the department's Office of Professional Standards the following morning. The complaint cited the initial stop, for which the dashboard camera footage showed that the taillight in question had been functional at the time of the stop. The baseless address discrepancy justification for detention, and Officer Prater's conduct during the interview, specifically the repeated language-based diminishment of her client, who was her mother, which Paulette was not separating in this filing because she had decided there was no reason to. The intake desk sergeant, Marcus Hollins, provided a written account to the Office of Professional Standards that was, by any measure, thorough. He included the Latin exchange and noted that he had looked up the phrase afterward, and that the translation struck him as, and he used these words in an official departmental document, directly accurate and also kind of magnificent. The two prior complaints against Prater were pulled and reviewed in the context of the new complaint. One had been filed by a Haitian immigrant who had been told her accent was too hard to understand during a traffic stop, resulting in no charges. This is the thing about patterns. They only become visible when someone looks at the whole shape. One incident is an incident. 3 is a curriculum. Prater was placed on administrative leave pending review. The review took 6 weeks. At its conclusion, the department issued a finding of sustained misconduct on 2 of 3 complaints. Prater was required to complete mandatory retraining in bias-free policing. A formal letter of reprimand was placed in his file. He was transferred to a non-public-facing administrative role pending supervisory assessment. The department also commissioned a review of its intake and interview procedures as they related to the treatment of elderly civilians and civilians, for whom English was an additional language. The review produced 3 procedural changes: a mandatory language access protocol, continuous camera recording in interview rooms with supervisory flagging for uncharged detentions, and a new intake checklist requiring supervisory sign-off for any detention exceeding 30 minutes without a formal charge. These changes bore no official name. But in the precinct, informally, among the officers who had been there that Tuesday and the ones who heard about it in the days after, they were known by a shorthand. They were called the grandmother rules. Paulette, when informed of this by Captain O.C. Mensah in a follow-up call, was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would find that funny, and also correct. The incident would have remained a local story except for one thing. Vivienne had a former doctoral student named James Achebe, who was now a journalist at a national publication covering law and civil rights, and who had heard, through a chain of 5 people, what had happened to his dissertation advisor. He called her. She answered on the second ring. He asked if she would speak on the record. She said, "James, you have never needed my permission to pursue a true story. Don't start now." The piece ran 8 weeks after the incident. It was titled, "On Language, Power, and the Woman Who Answered in Latin." It became the most read piece in the publication's history for its category that calendar year. It was read by former students of Vivienne's in 17 countries. It was shared in classics departments, law schools, philosophy programs, reading groups, churches. The comments, for once, were not a wasteland. They were full of people sharing their own versions, their grandmother's accents, the way they had been made to feel about the sound of their own voices, the languages they had hidden, the languages they had claimed. There was a particular category of comment that ran into the hundreds. From black scholars of classical antiquity, from professors of Latin and Greek at HBCUs, from people who had been told implicitly or explicitly that the dead languages of the Mediterranean were not for them, and who had learned them anyway. Who had learned them in many cases because of Vivienne Boudreau Holloway's books, or her reputation, or a single sentence of hers they had encountered in a footnote somewhere and never forgotten. She read every comment. At her kitchen table, in the mornings with coffee over 2 weeks, she told Paulette it was, and she chose this word deliberately, instructive, not heartening, not moving, instructive. because it told her something about the size of the silence that had surrounded these people and the size of what they had each built inside it. She got back to work. Her retirement, it became clear to everyone around her, was a geographical transition and not a professional one. She was writing a book. She was always writing a book, and the new one was titled The Grammar of Resistance, Classical Language and the African Intellectual Tradition. She had been working on it for 3 years. The incident and the weeks of comments she read at her kitchen table added 2 chapters. The Lewis and Short Dictionary sat on her desk in Atlanta, same as it always had been. Used, worn at the corners, consulted regularly, its margins dense with her grandfather's penciled notes and, layered over decades, her own. 2 generations of attention in the margins of a single book. Her doctoral students, scattered across universities from Atlanta to Lagos to London, dedicated a joint publication to her the year the book came out. In the dedication, they wrote, in Latin because they knew her well, a sentence that translated roughly as, "She taught us that language belongs to everyone willing to learn it, and that the only thing more powerful than a word is knowing when to use it." Vivian read the dedication. She called the student who had drafted it, a young woman now a professor in London, and said, "The ablative case in the 3rd clause is a little loose." The young woman laughed for a long time. Vivian said, "It's still beautiful. Thank you." On the side table in her Atlanta apartment, next to the Lewis and Short Dictionary, she placed a small card. She had written it herself, in her own hand, first in Latin and then in English, not because she needed the translation, but because she intended her grandchildren to read it, eventually, and she wanted them to have both. The Latin was, "Lingua tua non est error tuus, dos est." The English was, "Your language is not your flaw, it is your gift." If this story stayed with you, if you felt something when she folded her hands and began to speak, please like this video, share it with someone who needs it, subscribe if you're new, and hit the bell, and tell me, has anyone ever made you feel like the way you speak, your accent, your cadence, the sound of where you come from, was something to apologize for? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Here's what really gets me, though. Dennis Prater thought he was using language as a weapon. That's what the slow speech was. That's what real English meant. That's what the sideways smile at his partner was. The assumption that mockery, dressed in the costume of patience, is a form of control. And it works. It has worked for a very long time. In precincts and classrooms and boardrooms and at dinner tables, the performance of incomprehension as a tool of diminishment. I can't understand you. You don't belong in this conversation. The sound of you is the evidence against you. What he did not know, what he could not have imagined, because he had decided before she sat down what she was that the woman across the table had spent 50 years thinking about exactly this, about language as territory, about who gets to claim which words, about the decision made by her grandfather in New Orleans, passed down through his daughter and into her. To master the languages, the powerful said, were not for people like them, and to use those languages, precisely and calmly, to stand on ground someone had spent a long time insisting wasn't theirs. She didn't answer him in Latin to humiliate him. She answered him in Latin to show him the floor plan of what he didn't know about who he was talking to. To show him, and everyone in that room, and everyone who would read about it afterward, that the diminishment only works if the other person accepts the premise. She declined. So here is my question for you, not the public version, the real one. Think about the language you carry, not Latin necessarily, yours, the accent your parents had, the words that come from a grandmother's kitchen, the cadence that marks you as from somewhere specific, somewhere real, somewhere that certain rooms have decided is not the right kind of somewhere, the way you modulate your voice when you walk through certain doors, because you've learned that the particular sound of who you are makes certain people decide, before you've said anything important, what you are worth. Who told you that? And when are you going to put the Lewis and Short Dictionary on your desk and decide they were wrong? Lingua tua non est error tuus. Your language is not your flaw, it is your gift.